Thank you. Professor Yamauchi, Professor Ochiai, and the Mori Aranori Center, thank you very much for this wonderful invitation to speak today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be asked to talk at your esteemed university on the matter of liberal education in our globalizing world. I could spend the next half hour happily responding to the superb talks we've already heard, but I have prepared a talk which I would like to give you nonetheless. I've used this freedom which the university has given me to attempt to address some big themes. I beg your indulgence if not all these ideas are as yet perfectly formed. Indeed, that itself is one of the themes of this talk, that in periods where there appears to be considerable change, we should be generous in allowing some speculation and attempts at creative thinking, which may not meet all the conventions of academic rigor. If, therefore, at any point I fall short of this rigor, I hope at least that it is in the cause of productive thinking of a speculative sort. The title of this talk is inspired by my students, several of whom have told me that their studies have taught them the benefits of keeping an open mind. It contains several assumptions. We might list these as the world is complex, some version of Western liberal education is good for educating people for such a world, and the concept of openness is an integral part of the liberal tradition, and there are challenges in sustaining this concept and in implementing it. There are, therefore, three preliminaries to talk about: the complex world, liberal education, and openness. So we'll look briefly at each of these before returning to the main theme of our title, the challenge of remaining open. The idea of complexity is much in fashion. It is discussed in many parts of academia, the commercial and political world, and even recently on popular shows, such as the BBC's radio program, In Our Time. Complexity is a property of complex systems. Some well-known examples of such systems are the human brain, ecological systems in the natural world, transport networks, and business organizations. The mathematics of complex systems can quickly become sophisticated, but the main ideas are easy to understand. The complexity scientist Yanir Bar-Yam writes, quote, "Complex systems is the new approach to science, studying how relationships between parts give rise to the collective behaviors of a system, and how the system interacts and forms relationships with its environment," end quote. It was the insight of the American scientist Warren Weaver in 1948 that following a period of the analysis of simplicity, which he equated with Newtonian science, and a subsequent period focusing on the analysis of disorganized complexity, that is, systems of many non-interacting parts, which he equated with the statistical sciences of the 19th century, we are now in a period where the systems of interest are those of organized complexity, i.e., those consisting of many parts which interact with each other. Weaver was aware that as well as the questions of science, many political and economic problems might be addressed by considering politico-economic systems as those of organized complexity. Today, this approach has indeed spread to areas well outside the hard sciences and includes systems of individuals, machines, organizations, and so on. It is widely acknowledged that due to increasing interactions, both between humans themselves and between humans and their environment, we live in a world which is more complex in some meaningful way than it was, say, 50 years ago. Our growing understanding of complexity has developed in parallel with a world in which complex systems are increasingly evident. How might we best educate young people for this world? We'll return to this later. Let's look now briefly at liberal education. The roots of what is called liberal education in the Western tradition are usually traced back to the Roman orator Cicero, who lived at 106 to 42 before Christ. But there will always be some disagreement about an exact starting point. One can claim that something recognizable as liberal education begins at least with Socrates over 3 centuries earlier. In Socrates' form of education, we see also the first intimations of the connection between liberal education and democracy. Although Socrates was actually arguing against many aspects of the Athenian democracy in which he found himself, he was, as the philosopher Karl Popper points out, using many of the values and processes of that democracy to do so. Thus, in the teaching of Socrates, we see a greater equality between teacher and student, the role of reason in education, the challenge to authority, the importance of self-criticism, the importance that the individual should prove worthy of his liberation, and finally, by implication at least, the realization that social norms are mutable and ultimately our responsibility. For Cicero, liberal education was education worthy of a free person, i.e., not a slave, as well as a way of liberating the mind. And something like this view of liberal education became incorporated in the 7 liberal arts, to which Francis referred earlier, which dominated Western universities for the best part of 1,000 years, between the foundations of Bologna in 1088 and the reshaping of universities in the German and French models of the early 19th century. Of course, it would be a gross exaggeration to say that such a conception of education was always associated with freedom or an open development of the mind during this long period, but some vestige of Socrates and Cicero and other early educators remained in the spirit of Western education throughout, and was revived in the liberal arts colleges of the United States in the 19th century, and there it persists in the general conception of higher education to this day. Now we are seeing a revival of interest in liberal arts and sciences in the UK, at UCL where I work, and at King's College London, to take just 2 examples. And most interestingly, I think, of all, from a historic perspective, there is growing interest in India, China, and Japan. We will return to conjecture on why we are seeing these developments. Let us now look at our third theme, openness. This is really the hardest of the 3 themes to define. It is a grand concept in the vein of equality or compassion or liberty, something big but vague, something identifiable but imprecise. Yet it is no less important for that. We should not shy away from talk of such things, even at the risk of disagreement and some misunderstanding. As we have seen in the case of Socrates, there's a link between a liberal education and democracy. Many Western thinkers, from John Dewey and in our own time Martha Nussbaum and Gert Biester, have written on this connection. But it was Popper, in The Open Society and Its Enemies, who developed the understanding of an open society and forged links between this concept and democracy. Popper's analysis of openness can be applied to all human systems, including systems of education. Let us then use this analysis to think about what openness might look like in an educational context. Popper contrasts an open society with what he calls a magical, tribal, or sometimes collectivist societies. These latter societies are those in which fate, or the gods, or others are to blame for imperfections. In such closed societies, personal decisions are minimized or imputed to others in order to divest oneself of personal responsibility. There is no expectation that society might change itself, or that the individuals who comprise that society are ultimately responsible for it. However, human societies, on a proper analysis, are inherently open and changeable because they are the continued and evolving responsibility of the humans who constitute them. Popper is aware of the burdens this places on us. Indeed, perhaps second only to the depth of analysis of the open society is his repetition of the strain this openness places on the individuals within it. Thus, he says, the Greeks suffered a severe strain which had begun with the rise of democracy and individualism, end quote. And the, quote, revolt against civilization is a reaction against the strain of the demand for personal responsibility, end quote. This strain leads to a longing for more closed societies. But this is a mistake. There is no perfect state, no golden age, and there are no laws of history that might take us to such a state. There is only the law, if we may call it that the future is open and in our gift. Popper did not use the language of systems analysis, but it is clear that his discussion of society can be widely applied to human systems. Such systems must allow for evolution, criticism, revision, the challenge to authority, and the possibility of piecemeal change, as Popper called it, if they are not to contradict the openness that comes with the very fact that it is rational, mutable, problem-solving creatures ourselves from which they are made. Open systems appeal to our universal humanity then, but they also demand a lot of us. They cause us strain, or as we might say in contemporary English, stress. In such situations, it is all too easy for us to turn away from them, to get tired of the responsibility they demand, and to destroy them when the strain becomes too much. If we are to champion the concept of openness in human systems, we cannot be naive about their many failings. They are always messy and always imperfect. Nevertheless, I believe Popper is right. If we are not to fall into cynicism and despair, we must defend the openness of human systems. For, quote, if we wish to remain human, then there is only one way. We must go into the unknown, the uncertain, and insecure, using what reason we may have, end quote. Having examined the three themes of our title, the complex world, liberal education, and openness of human systems, I'll now attempt some connections. We return to the question of growing interest in liberal education in many parts of the world today. Why might countries as different as China, India, and Japan, with their own rich histories that owe little to the thinking of Socrates, Cicero, and others, consider such an education of value to their young people and to their country? Here I must turn to both the central and most speculative part of my argument. It could be that the combination of significance and speculation is inevitable at this stage. We are searching for new ways of conceiving and a new language with which to operate. I am only attempting to give a preliminary lie of the land, a description of a scenario in which openness, liberal education, and our complex world are connected. It will take more work to describe these connections with greater precision. So we've seen that the world is more complex, and also that a liberal education is open in that it is concerned with criticism, evolution, and the possibility of change. It remains to argue, or at least indicate, that it is in this openness that gives rise to complexity in the educational context, and that the person educated in this environment, an environment in which they are introduced to more complex ideas and asked to carry out more complex tasks, will be better fitted for more complex situations in which they find themselves after graduation. In fact, I think both these connections, that between openness and complexity, and that between a more complex education and being better prepared for more complex environments, are somewhat common sense, even if not usually discussed in these terms. To consider the first connection, imagine that a human system is closed to outside influences and that its rules and processes are established and not allowed to evolve. It is hard then to imagine how it could become more complex. If no new relationships are introduced into the system and internal innovation and developments are repressed, where would increased complexity come from? We can see examples of such education systems in totalitarian regimes and fundamentalist theocracies. The body of knowledge and the methods of teaching are fixed. Students are barely, if at all, positively exposed to developments in other cultures. And even scientific work which challenges fundamental tenets is suppressed or banned. We are subsequently not surprised if students emerging from such systems do not have what we might call a complex world view. We can extend this argument, for if we acknowledge that a closed education system does not allow for increasing complexity, and the lack of a complex education will not prepare us to understand a complex world, then it is a matter of logic that in order to cope better with an increasingly complex world, we need an education which in some sense introduces us to complexity, and this in turn must be open. So what would it mean for us to be educated to better handle complexity? And how might such an education look? In this space, I can only very briefly address these questions, but the work of developmental psychologist Robert Kegan can help us here. Kegan's position, based on many years of longitudinal study, is that there are several developmental stages of increasing mental complexity, extending well into adulthood. This complexity increases our capacity to take multiple perspectives on a problem, and even to see ourselves as in some way multiple. There is an embracing of plurality, not at the cost of relativism, but with an enhanced ability, quote, to understand the other's position on the other's own terms, to extend empathy for the costs involved in altering that position, and to provide support for, rather than dismissal of, the prior position, end quote. At this stage of development, the subject sees the possibility of increased complexity as a possibility for growth, not as a problem to be solved. Kegan has interesting things to say about the advantages of such a mindset for both leadership, which we haven't actually talked about much today, but is the title of our conference here today. Kegan says this mental complexity is useful for both leadership and for conflict resolution. Such things as might apply to university graduates in a variety of situations. And his thought gives us one way to understand what it means for us to better cope with complexity and to see the value in achieving this understanding. How might we educate for this? Well, it seems clear to me that we must be brave in presenting students with complex ideas. Simple matters of fact will not constitute such an education, and the curriculum will need to include so-called wicked problems which have no obvious solution and on which many will disagree. The tasks we set our students should also be complex in some way, for example, by including several variables which they will have to negotiate. A team project is one way to inject complexity into an assignment, and there are other ways, such as asking students to view a problem from two disciplinary perspectives, or asking them to apply a concept or technique learned in class to some situation outside the classroom, where more variables generally come into play. Kegan is actually circumspect about asking that all people achieve his fifth level of mental complexity, arguing that some forms of mental development can only happen later in life, towards middle age, in fact. But I would like to be bolder. Although we cannot expect, and perhaps should not even want, everyone to achieve this level of mental complexity, I think that if such a thing were to become better understood as a cognitive phenomenon, then it would also become teachable to younger people. We have precedents of this in related areas, for example, in the teaching of empathy to small children in the Roots of Empathy program in Canada. Once societal norms are better understood, it becomes possible to teach them to younger generations. This discussion of the connections between openness, complexity, and the sort of education that might benefit our students for a complex world is necessarily brief here. I hope I have made the prospect of such an education attractive, even if much is still imprecise. But if the argument for a more open education is attractive, if it is plausible that to negotiate a more complex world, your education must expose you to more complex ideas and tasks, then why do we face difficulties in maintaining this stance? Why the challenge of this talk? The reason, I think, takes us back to Popper and his analysis of a widespread tendency in the way we react to changes in human systems. For, quite simply, we are in the throes of a revolution. Not a political revolution, at least not yet, but rather a revolution in many aspects of our relationship with knowledge. There's something unsatisfactory about this phrase, relationship with knowledge, for what could we leave out of such a relationship? But its use indicates that we are seeking a way to describe intimations of great change, brought about by what the technology historian John Norton calls, quote, radical transformations in our communications environment, end quote. These changes promise to be more global than previous knowledge revolutions due to our greater connectedness. And the changes that are already with us, coupled with talk of even greater changes to come, are putting a strain on many aspects of our relationship with knowledge. We argue about what is known, what should be allowed to be known, how to teach it, what we should learn, how to conduct research, how much to respect academic authority, how to understand the nature of expertise, the role of universities, and so on. The strain we feel in the light of these changes is analogous to strains felt during shifts in previous political uncertainties. As the technology writer David Weinberger notes, they are making us uncomfortable. In Popper's analysis, he traces the desire of Plato for a closed society to the experience of unprecedented societal disruption. Similarly, this radical disturbance in our relationship with knowledge has us longing for a golden age of stability and certainty when we could rely on authority, and even innovation itself was despised. There's a famous passage in Francis Bacon where he uses the word innovator as an insult in somebody else's language. In education, as in politics, in times of change, often the impulse is to try to stop the change, repress innovation, micromanage, over-constrain, divest oneself of responsibility, only value what we can measure, and only conceive of measuring what we already know. In education, too, the temptation in times of uncertainty is to systematize more box-ticking, more spoon-feeding, more tightly defined learning outcomes, more bureaucracy, and more standardized testing. Ultimately, however, to stop change requires constraining forces, and in the world of human affairs, this requires repression, even violence. The ideal longed for in the closed systems of which Plato dreamt is that in which there is no change. The illusion is that such closedness can give us lasting security with none of the strain that change brings. But how dangerous this can be in politics as in education. In fact, in times of change, this closing down of systems is the opposite of what we should do. Rather than a reactionary retreat, we should meet the challenge of uncertainty and embrace the value of being open. This is not easy, as many champions of democracy have found in closed political systems. But in the educational sphere, it is the important challenge to educators today, faced with upheavals caused by the internet and changes in our relationship with knowledge. These upheavals require new approaches. However, as we have indicated, many of the values of classical liberal education can enable its practitioners to find such approaches. For the values of such an education manifest themselves in a pedagogical context in this idea of openness. In openness lies the fundamental notion that whatever human system we inhabit can be changed. As educationalists O'Hear and Sidwell say, at the deep level, quote, liberal education is concerned with matters of intellectual praxis and motivation, end quote, rather than the imposition of particular points of view, end quote. And this level of generality, properly understood, can allow for us to make the necessary changes. Now, these are, as one might say, fine words. And even if one should never dismiss the power of words and the changes in perception that they can induce, I do understand the need for at least some practical indications of what we might do, what the first steps should be. So I will try to give a brief indication of what we are attempting at UCL. I want to make it clear at this point that we are not making any claim to be revolutionary or uniquely original. In some ways, on the contrary, in some ways we are reapplying the historic and tested educational values and approaches of Socrates, Cicero, and the US liberal arts system, while rethinking our curriculum, our assessments, our bureaucratic structures, and our educational philosophy. in the context of UK higher education and the global changes outlined above. Further, I personally make no claim to be a theoretical expert in this field. What we have learnt, or more accurately are learning, is the result of what is called action research. That is, we are seeking to same some of the rules, the parameters, the philosophy, the goals and ambitions within our community of practice by a cycle of innovation, implementation, measurement, and reflection. Our first move when planning the degree I would describe as setting the frames high. This means, in a fairly general way, we tried to use some of the principles of universal design. I think it might be called bariafuri in Japanese, but I'm not sure if anyone here would know that phrase, to form a curriculum which, while having a frame, nevertheless allows for maximum diversity and individuality of study within that frame. The principles of universal design grew out of an approach to the built environment, adopted to increase ease of access and use, especially for those with disabilities. Certain of these principles, such as flexibility, intuitiveness, and tolerability for error, are also applicable to curriculum design. One way in which this manifests itself is allowing students to take courses across a range of departments, including in such combinations as literature and engineering, or biology and philosophy, which may have had little to do with each other for decades, if at all. It is important to note here that a more open educational system does not mean an anarchistic system, just as a more open society does not mean an anarchistic one. We do have a structure, as can be viewed at our website, only it is perhaps more universal and more open to evolution, as one of our students described it, than some degrees. Having set our frames high, we try to allow our students to move into this universal space in the way which most interests them. As one example of this, we try to set assignments which may go in individual ways. We often allow students to be creative in their assignments. This can actually be straightforward when setting assignments in new media, where students have more interesting ideas than their teachers and are more proficient in realizing them. But it is also possible in more traditional forms of assessment. So, to take an example from this lecture, we might teach students about the concept of complexity, but then ask them to produce an essay showing how this concept could be applied to an area of their interest, be it economics, anthropology, engineering, or literature. Of course, we advise and guide students in the process, but we try to be open to the possibility that the student may take the assessment in directions we had not predicted. In my experience, whenever one mentions the possibility of allowing students to be more creative, there is a worry about rigor. But I think this is misplaced. Teachers must never lose their standards of grammar, logic, mathematical accuracy, literary quality, and so on. But these can be applied in the form of a critical dialogue with the student, even in cases where the work produced is somewhat new to the teacher. Indeed, for a teacher to show the confidence that they can engage intelligently with new material is itself an important lesson for the student to see. As most professional lives, as we've heard today, will now involve numerous occasions in which one meets new material, new ways of working, and new cultures, the ability to greet such novelty with an open yet critical mind is a valuable ability in itself. Now, I'm going to run over a little bit. I beg your forgiveness, but I've got a couple of minutes and I'm going to overrun a little bit as well. You're coming towards the last part of the talk. This ability to greet novelty with an open mind is one of what I understand as one of the attributes of a lifelong learner, much prized by many industries today. Most likely, this cannot be taught as a set of formulae or propositions, but it can be demonstrated by example. Be open with your students who produce new work and say, well, this is new to me, but I think this bit works and this bit doesn't, and these are the reasons. Of course, there are substantial administrative and cultural challenges which come with this more open approach. On the administrative side, the main challenge is tension between the iron cage of bureaucracy, which seeks standardization and sometimes over-regulation, and the desire to keep an open, creative environment, which is increasingly more reflective of the world outside of universities, or at least the best part of that world, the parts we aspire to, the parts in which many university graduates will operate, and one hopes the best parts of academia. Another administrative issue is that such an individualized approach to learning is time-consuming for teachers. Again, there is no quick fix here, but one can try to delegate to younger staff where appropriate, and even to more senior students on the program who understand the value of openness and are confident enough to adopt this approach. This is not always easy. There will be strain. But just because it is not easy does not mean it is not a good way, maybe the best way, to proceed. I want to emphasize again that much of this is not new. At some of the greatest universities in England, which we've heard about today, and the US, students have considerable freedom in their studies. At UCL, perhaps one innovation we are making, which is not generally allowed at Oxbridge, is to allow undergraduates to cross the humanities and social sciences and sciences divide, so long as the combination is meaningful and productive. We encourage students to seek their own interdisciplinary combinations. Thus, on the arts and sciences degree, we have students studying combinations of engineering, law, and development economics, the goal being to understand better the nature of large-scale engineering projects in the developing world. Or someone studying computer sciences, philosophy, and art history, to seek better to understand the connections between general cognition and an appreciation of art, and many other fascinating combinations I could tell you. However, the broader principle of a more open education has long been understood by many traditional academics. It is only that the maintaining of this openness is a constant challenge as higher education becomes more of a mass process and the reactions to change we noted above impinge upon it. In this environment, openness will need constant psychological and intellectual vigilance to maintain. There are cultural as well as administrative challenges. Within the UK, the school system has become very test-driven, and numerous voices express a concern that, quote, students can no longer think for themselves, end quote. Some of these concerns may be the repeated historical mistake of believing that things were always better in the past. But certainly, if we wish to espouse a value of openness in education as the best way to deal with change and complexity, we need students to enter into the culture and spirit of this enterprise, and indeed to think somewhat for themselves. Socratic dialogue requires at least two people, and this form of education cannot make much progress if students are not willing or able to take responsibility for their learning and to treat their teachers with respect, but without blind deference to authority. This shift in students' perception of a teacher from someone of almost mythical status who knows so much and must be believed to someone who is essentially an equal, albeit someone with more knowledge and experience, is something that is perhaps more difficult to negotiate in cultures which are less democratic or open, but it is also problematic in the more informal West, where younger students can find it hard to achieve a middle ground between a respect born of fear and a lack of respect for those they may feel are only peers. I have mentioned that in a sense our project at UCL is action research, but how will we know if this conception of higher education has worked? What kinds of data might we collect? How will we judge whether we have anything like a body of theory upon which to build? Ultimately, I think the answer is simple. It will have worked if the students think it has worked. If graduates are able to articulate why this form of education has been of value to them, that is evidence enough. To find this out, we can simply ask them. But we also have some proxies, some more quantitative measures that might satisfy those who seek proof by these means. In no particular order, these are, number one, if students score good grades according to the criteria of the institution. Number two, if they get good jobs upon graduation. And number three, if they are able to progress to master's and research degrees of their interest. So far, all of these measures are positive for the arts and sciences degree at UCL, which I run. Our students have already been offered excellent graduate prospects in law, financial services, consultancy, manufacturing services, journalism, marketing, and so on. And one of our students has launched his own tech startup company, with which we have assisted him with. The grades of all our students are strong and comparable to established single honors degrees. And the people in the final year of their degree are applying to master's programs in public policy, energy systems, law, development economics, and so on. As we develop, we will need to guard against the closing of the rigid jaws of bureaucracy, the bland and stifling systematization that can come with established processes and philosophies. We too will have to keep, try that one more time, we too will have to work at remaining open. It is the only way we will be able to evolve to educate our students for a world of increasing complexity and to meet the exciting challenges that the knowledge revolution is presenting to us. Thank you very much.